Oh, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Winter has arrived here at Smug & Play headquarters, and I'm just warming my feet by the fire. With Christmas just a few short 3D Mark runs away, it's time for yet another holiday build video. You may recall that last year we put together a smoking hot mid-2000s gaming rig featuring AMD's Socket 939 Swan Song, the delightful Athlon 64 FX60. What you might not have known is that that video was intended to be an AMD versus Intel shootout, comparing each chipmaker's top offerings in January of 2006. Due to technical issues and time constraints, we didn't have a chance to show you Intel's side of the story. Well, viewers, your Christmas gift this year is that second half. Now, back in January of 2006, Intel, outgunned by AMD's more efficient architecture, was struggling to provide competitive offerings to enthusiasts and generally remain relevant in the x86 CPU space. Gee, doesn't that sound familiar? Enter the 900 series of NetBurst-based Pentium products, the Rocket Lake CPUs of their day. On January 16, 2006, just 1 week after the release of AMD's world-beating FX60, Intel responded with the Pentium Extreme Edition 955, a 3.46 GHz dual-chip beast built on a 65nm process and a then monstrous 130-watt TDP. Was it a match for AMD's flagship at 2.6 GHz, or the 2.8 GHz we painlessly overclocked ours to? There's only one way to find out. Okay, so that's sort of a lie. You can also just look at old AnandTech articles, but there's only one fun way to find out, and that's to rebuild last year's holiday rig using the corresponding Intel platform. Now, sadly, I don't actually own a Pentium Extreme Edition 955, but what I do have is this Pentium D960, released to absolutely no fanfare in May of 2006. It's based on the same Pressler microarchitecture as the Extreme Edition, with an even higher 3.6 GHz stock clock. This C1 stepping chip even has the same 130-watt TDP as the Extreme Edition. The only area where it doesn't quite measure up is the front side bus, as this chip, like all 900 series Ds, is intended to operate at 800 megatransfers a second, as opposed to the 1066 of the Extreme. But hey, that's what overclocking is for, and who better than that than our old friend ASUS. Our motherboard this time around is this ASUS Commando, an LGA 775 board built around an Intel P965 North Bridge and ICH 8R South Bridge. Now I know that didn't actually launch until May of 06, so we're not exactly period correct here, but cut me some slack, because there are a couple things that intrigued me about this board. First of all, the name. Most motherboards, they have some numbers in the name that indicate the chipset or the CPU it supports, but no, not this one. It's just the Commando. A number of clickbait titles for a Smug & Play video immediately came to mind, like Smug & Play goes Commando, and so I just had to bid on it. And the other thing that surprised me was the asking price, just $10 for a vintage, seemingly high-end Republic of Gamers product. How could I go wrong here? So, well, some of you out there are no doubt already aware of this board's limitations, but let me step you through the highs and lows now. So on the plus side, we have an 8-phase capacitorless CPU VRM, which is quite impressive for the period, and it meets the substantial power requirements of our Big D. We also have some incredible CPU and RAM overclocking features, such as the ability to adjust FSB in 1 MHz increments from 100 all the way up to 667 MHz, and DRAM voltage from 1.8 volts to a kind of insane 3.375 volts in 0.025 volt steps. There are also tons of fan connectors, lots of space for unconventional coolers, and even a cute backlit LCD on the rear panel that displays postcodes. As far as the disadvantages, well, where to start? Apart from the overclocking settings, the AMI BIOS is crap. The included high-def audio solution is really more for home theater use than gaming, And that second full 16x PCIe slot down there, yeah, that's really only a 4x PCIe slot, and this board does not support SLI, only Crossfire. So here's some footage of me being an idiot, dropping in two 7900 GTs and then scratching my head when the drivers won't enable them. So we'll only be using the Radeon X1900 XT for this comparison, which is fine by me. As I said in last year's video, it's the Rodney Dangerfield of graphics cards. Rounding out our build are two 1GB sticks of CAS Latency 5 OCZ Platinum PC2-6400, a copper core PWM cooler from an HP workstation, and the same donk case as last year. So, how does this extreme Intel machine stack up against our AMD build? Well, before we get to the gaming benchmarks, let's talk about its room heating capabilities. Our FX60 rig tore through games of the era, but its relatively efficient Athlon 64 architecture didn't do much to keep my toes warm, with total system consumption at paltry 230 watts even when playing F.E.A.R with those SLI'd 7900 GTs. I'm happy to say that this year's rig is, for early 2006 at least, a real coal roller, consuming 185 watts just sitting in the BIOS. So let's start off with some 3D Mark 03 at a custom 1280 by 1024 resolution. With scores nearly identical to the 14,449 we recorded with our AMD rig, our Big D is clearly not bottlenecking the X1900 XT, and as with the FX60, with this GPU, 3D Mark 06 is an absolute slideshow. Sadly, performance parity did not carry over to actual gaming. Performance in 2004's Far Cry at 1280 by 1024 on very high settings was excellent, but still a far cry from AMD's exceptional numbers, with the D achieving an average of 81 FPS, lows of 63, and a max of 106 compared to the FX60's 107 FPS average, 58 frames per second lows, and max at 197. The D fares a bit better in F.E.A.R, but it's pretty much the same story. Testing with the built-in benchmark at 1280 by 1024 in maximum settings, minimum and average frame rates were consistently a few percentage points lower than we saw with the FX60. Our results were pretty consistent with the Nantex benchmarks from back in the day, comparing Intel's D-series CPUs to AMD's FX62, which is equivalent to our overclocked FX60, with the net burst CPUs being either a bit or significantly slower in gaming. In Oblivion, a more CPU-sensitive title, Anantech observed a 50% difference in average frame rate between the D960 and FX62. Yikes! So how about overclocking then? Well, it didn't take much effort to beat the later 965 Extreme Edition's 3.73 GHz stock clock with a quick bump to 202 MHz FSB. Feeling lucky, I hopped back into the BIOS and pushed the FSB to 222 MHz, or 888 megatransfers per second, for an even 4 GHz core clock. This brought performance in F.E.A.R much closer to the FX60 running at 2.8 GHz, and likely beyond its stock performance at 2.6 GHz. The machine was completely stable at 1.256 volts V-core, and temperatures were still looking reasonable, so I decided to take things a step further to try going to 4.2 GHz at a 233 MHz FSB. It took the Commando and I a few attempts, but soon enough we were back in Windows at 4.2 GHz and ready to benchmark again. And finally, it happened. At 4.2 GHz, we had essentially matched the FX60 at 2.8 GHz with a 39 frame per second minimum, 85 frame per second average, and a maximum frame rate all the way up there at 229 in F.E.A.R at maximum settings. And Crysis still sucks, but hey, no surprise there. And with total system power consumption now around 290 watts, my toes were nice and toasty. Well, what can be said about the Pentium D that hasn't been said 1,000 times already by other YouTubers? It's two inefficient net burst cores packaged together the way that Costco Wholesale packages tubs of mayonnaise, with performance roughly equivalent to said mayonnaise, at least at the stock speeds. But what did impress me was the flexibility of the Commando motherboard. Not only will this thing happily overclock a Pentium D beyond 4 GHz on air, but because of its extremely flexible FSB and DRAM settings, you can drop in a Core 2 Duo E8600 like this one, or a Core 2 Quad Q9650 with a 1333 mega transfer front side bus, and suddenly you have a very different machine that's very capable of running the games of 2007 and beyond, assuming that you paired it with a later graphics card such as this 8800 GTS. But that will be a tale for another day. For now, I want to say thank you very much for being a viewer. Merry Christmas to you and to your families, to my brother who gifted me the Pentium D960. Smug and Play will return in the new year, and we hope to see you then. Take care.